Hey everyone, how's it going? Today I want to talk a little bit about the carrier-based bombers of the United States Navy in World War II. At the start of World War II in 1939, America, not yet participating, their current stable of dive and torpedo bombers was pretty lackluster. At that point, the Curtiss SB2C Helldiver and Douglas TBD Devastator were their primary dive and torpedo bombers, respectively. The SB2C Helldiver, not to be confused with the later SB2C Helldiver, was a single-engine biplane, first ordered back in 1932, first flown in 1935, and introduced in 1938. And at the time of its introduction, it was already pretty well outdated, with below-average speed, a poor armament, and a lackluster payload. The TBD Devastator, on the other hand, was at least a little bit innovative when it was first flown in 1935, being the first all-metal monoplane for the United States Navy. But at the same time, its top speed was actually lower than the later model SB2C Helldivers, and its armor was considered to be insufficient. This overall lacking outfit of naval aircraft then led to a metaphorical blitz of modernizing and new design requests and new accepted designs. From the design competition that led to the TBD Devastator, eventually came the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, introduced in 1940, and in a bid to replace the Devastator in 1939 would come the TBF Avenger, later introduced in 1942. These two carrier-based bombers ended up forming a good part of the backbone of U.S. naval forces for the bulk of the war, being two of the planes that helped turn the tide against Japan and annihilate their naval fleet, and they became an absolute terror to Japanese shipping and cargo vessels. Even though the Dauntless and Avenger ended up being very important and dominant before America officially entered the war in December 1941, as part of that overall blitz of modernizing, the Navy continued looking into the future, and predicted or feared that their new planes may be rapidly outclassed and quickly obsolete, as their previous stable was outclassed basically as they entered service, and they would begin searching for new dive and torpedo bombers. Our subject for today is one of those planes, a plane that was intended to replace the Douglas SBD Dauntless, and later, as part of a different call from the U.S. Navy, a plane that was intended to replace the Dauntless again, along with the SB2C Helldiver and the TBF Avenger. This is the Douglas XSB2D, later known as the Douglas BTD Destroyer. The story of the destroyer begins in early 1941, on the heels of an announcement by the U.S. Navy the previous year that they were constructing a new, larger class of aircraft carriers in the Essex class, the first of which, in the USS Essex, would be commissioned at the end of 1942. With this new class of carrier on the horizon, the U.S. Navy went about properly outfitting them, both ordering aircraft already in development, like the Dauntless and the eternally in development hell SB2C Helldiver, along with some new prospective designs. Releasing the requested specs in early to mid-1941, the U.S. Navy's envisioned new dive bomber was ideally to have the following: a Curtiss-Wright R3350 radial engine, tricycle landing gear with a nose wheel, two twin 50 cal remote-controlled turrets, one in the dorsal position and one in the ventral, laminar flow wings, a de-icing system for the tail and wings, and an internal bomb bay with double the capacity of its predecessors. To this request, two companies and two designs would come to the forefront in Douglas's XSB2D and Curtiss-Wright's XSB3C. Curtiss's design was a rather bold move for them, considering that their SB2C Helldiver design was again in development hell and hadn't really proved successful yet. And despite their ongoing issues with the Helldiver, their XSB3C design was nevertheless awarded a contract for two prototypes in mid-1941, and Douglas's design was awarded the same contract at roughly the same time. At least in theory, both judging by other projects and their development cycles, along with the Navy's expectations for these projects. The first prototypes of each of these designs would be ready to fly for the first time in about 12 months, basically around June-July 1942. The Douglas design measuring in at 11.77 meters long, 14.64 meters wide, and 5.05 meters tall, it looked like a bizarre yet interesting little mishmash. The front of the plane, the nose, the cowling, and cockpit bore a strong resemblance to the Douglas A-20 Havoc and the later Douglas B-26 Invader, just, smaller, and with an R-3350 radial engine in the nose. While it's entirely possible that this design similarity was coincidental, the more likely reason is the fact that all three of these designs shared a common designer, in Ed Heinemann, and it seems more to me anyway that Ed found a general shape that he liked and stuck with it for a little while. Moving a little bit back to the wings, Ed elected to go with inverted gull wings, similar to the Ju-87 Stuka and F-4U Corsair, and this decision was largely due to the increased bomb capacity requirement, as the bomb capacity of the internal bomb bay had to be increased significantly unless they wanted to make the fuselage ridiculously large or oddly shaped. There would be rather little extra room in the fuselage for things that weren't the bombs. This meant that the landing gear would not be able to fold up into the fuselage in any capacity, and instead they had to fold solely into the wing, to both increase the strength and durability of the landing gear legs, and to support the increased bomb load, and to keep the legs short enough to stay solely in the wings. The inverted gull wings were chosen. Located in those inverted gull wings would be a pair of 20 mil cannons, both for defensive and complementary offensive purposes, along with some hat-style dive brakes that were basically horizontal slats protruding from the top and bottom of the wing, and in between those gull wings would be nestled the bomb bay, and as you can see from the front, due to the increased capacity, the fuselage shape kind of deformed, from being relatively cylindrical to being trapezoidal, but as a result, the internal bomb bay capacity was 3,200 pounds, and up to an additional 1,000 pounds could be held externally on two underwing hardpoints. Moving slightly back from the wings would be the back half of the cockpit that would contain the gunner and bombardier, and right behind him would be a pair of twin 50 cal machine gun turrets. As they were remote controlled, they were pretty small and looked like two frisbees or pizzas with little legs sticking out. And following back from that all the way to the tail, the Douglas design had a rather large vertical tail surface, an angular one that abruptly stopped around midway between the tip of the tail and the rear cockpit canopy. This abrupt end was due to the dorsal turret, to give it enough space to rotate left and right. But all in all, the Douglas design was a rather enticing one that certainly had a lot of potential. As for the Curtiss design, there's a lot less information on it out there, and not even the plane's dimensions seem to exist anymore, but just visually, it appeared to be generally similar to the SB2C Helldiver, but with a larger tail and a more spade-shaped fuselage to account for an internal bomb load of 4,000 pounds, to go along with 6 forward-firing 50 cal machine guns and an additional 1,000 pounds that could be held externally. Now, as you may have already guessed by the lack of information on it, the Curtiss design was rather quickly eliminated from the competition, as construction on and initial testing of both designs was being done, like wind tunnel testing and whatnot. It was found that the Curtiss design was already inferior enough that it simply did not warrant continuing, and sometime in 1942, the prototype contract for it would be cancelled. On the other side, with the Douglas design being the de facto winner of the competition, while its initial testing showed it to be an enticing design, overall work on it was incredibly slow. This was because Douglas Aircraft as a whole, and more specifically their El Segundo, California division, was very much preoccupied with other projects, probably planes like the Dauntless, and DC-3 and A-20 Havoc, and those were just the planes that were in production already, and not other prototype and experimental projects they had going on at the same time. Simply put, they had a lot going on at the moment, and resources to the XSB2D were then pretty limited. Despite the intent for it to fly 12 months after being ordered, it wasn't until over 21 months later, on April 8, 1943, that the first prototype took to the air. In its initial flight testing, the Douglas design showed that it very well may have been worth the wait. For comparison's sake, we'll use the Dauntless, specifically the SBD5 version that saw a production run near 3,000. The top speed of that Dauntless model was 255 miles an hour, with a max payload of 2,250 pounds and a range of 1,115 miles. The XSB2D, on the other hand, managed a top speed nearly 100 miles an hour greater, at 346 miles an hour, with its internal payload alone being 3,200 pounds, and its range sat at 1,480 miles, even compared to the SB2C Helldiver, which up to this point had not entered combat yet, but was at least in production. The XSB2D was about 50 miles an hour faster, and had a greater payload and greater range. All around, the XSB2D showed a lot of promise, and after an alteration to the dive brakes that changed them to thinner picket fence brakes on the wings, and 4 small perforated brakes on the rear fuselage, Douglas's new design appeared to be well on its way to production, and indeed in late August 1943, a contract for 345 SB2Ds was officially issued to Douglas. However, by mid to late 1943, as construction on the first production models began, the war situation had drastically changed, and American technology had improved, and these changes necessitated some alterations to the Douglas design, and these changes would have to be made to these production models. This meant that even though there was a contract in place, production couldn't really begin until these upgrades were tested and made. As Allied forces increasingly took control of the skies in the Pacific, the defensive armament on the XSB2D was just no longer necessary, and in an effort to streamline things and make planes more versatile, the Navy wanted planes like the XSB2D to have greater speed and the ability to perform other roles, like torpedo bomber. They also found that the second crew member, who would be the rear gunner and bombardier, just wasn't necessary either, and the pilot could perform his bombardier role just fine on his own. This meant that the new design could just be a single-seater instead of a two-seater. So this alteration in what the Navy wanted, of course, then led to a significant shift in the XSB2D project, with design alterations and even a name change. The second crew member was removed, the back half of the cockpit was removed, and the twin rear-facing turrets were removed. With the removal of the rear turrets, the vertical tail surface was able to complete, and with the reduction in weight from all that was removed, Douglas would elect to add in some additional armor around the pilot, along with some extra fuel storage. They also decided to make the inverted gull wing angle less severe. The reason for this I'm not entirely sure. And on those gull wings, the wing-mounted dive brakes would be outright removed, and instead, all of the dive brakes were now concentrated on the fuselage just behind the bomb bay, for so-called banana peel-style brakes. Ideally, this alteration would help improve airflow over the wings and improve top speed. All in all, this new design was given the new name of Douglas BTD, and the BTD-1 would take to the air for the first time about 11 months after its predecessor did, flying on March 5, 1944. The first flights of the BTD were a slight mixed bag, with some elements that improved and one that was worse. What was now worse was the top speed, which dropped ever so slightly down to 344 miles an hour, just 2 miles an hour less than its predecessor. Even though a lot of things were removed from the previous design due to the addition of, among other things, more armor and extra fuel storage, the gross weight of the new design had actually increased from 16,273 pounds to 18,140. But other than that, the stability and control of the plane actually improved over its predecessor, and as a torpedo bomber, it was able to carry 2 torpedoes under fuselage. The performance of the new design was solid enough that production was allowed to proceed, and the first production model, BTD-1, would be delivered in June 1944. This likely meant that if all went well, the BTD would start appearing in combat probably by the end of 1944 or the beginning of 1945. However, the original designer of the XSB2D and the BTD, Ed Heinemann, he saw the performance of the BTD much differently, and he viewed it much more negatively. According to him in his book, Ed Heinemann, Combat Aircraft Designer, while the performance of the BTD had overall improved, Ed was well aware that other companies, his competitors, had been working on and had received contracts for their own single-seat, single-engine multi-role attack planes, with Martin working on the AM Mauler, Curtiss on the XBTC, and Kaiser Fleet Wings on the XBTK. All of these aircraft would promise a greater overall armament, greater speed, or both, and Ed saw the writing on the wall. With these planes in development, the BTD would very quickly be overtaken by them, and something had to be done to keep Douglas in the race. And so, in an incredibly bold move, Ed, in a conference with the Navy and Bureau of Aeronautics, proposed something pretty shocking. As everybody present at this conference was debating the Douglas BTD Destroyer and whether or not it was worth continuing, Ed requested the floor for a proposal, and seemingly out of nowhere, Ed requested that the Navy cancel the production contract of the BTD, absolutely stunning the room. Back over at Douglas Aircraft, Ed and his team had recently started work on a plane that was comparable to the other multi-role attackers that were in development, something that they called the Dauntless II, a single-seat, single-engine monoplane powered by an R2800 radial engine. Surprisingly, the Navy ended up agreeing to the request, but under the stipulation that they use the bigger and more powerful R3350 engine. This was something that Ed wasn't terribly thrilled about, but nonetheless acquiesced to. Apparently, too, the Navy gave them 24 hours to present their design, and they actually managed to do that, and it was accepted and given the designation of XBT2D. With this new design being accepted, the BTD Destroyer design was kind of screwed, and whatever planes were on the production lines were able to be completed, but most of that project's resources were then quickly diverted over to the new one. In total, 30 BTD destroyers were made, and none of them ever saw combat. On an interesting note, though, one of them was converted into a mixed propulsion tester that had a single Westinghouse 19 turbojet engine, just sort of slapped in behind the pilot. This experiment was a failure, though, as the engine didn't fire properly and led to no boost in performance. As for the new extension of the BTD in the XBT2D, this design could be its own video entirely, but for the Cliff Notes version, a flyable prototype was produced rather quickly, and by March 1945 it was in the air. This design had an initial bomb load that maxed out at 6,000 pounds. Its gross weight was actually lower than the BTD, and it had a top speed upwards of 375 miles an hour. It was an incredibly promising design that was only slightly hampered by the end of World War II later that year, but regardless, it lived on and became the venerable Douglas A-1 Skyraider, a plane that ended up serving until the early 1970s. So, safe to say, Douglas Aircraft and Ed Heinemann made the correct choice in killing the BTD Destroyer project, even though the BTD and even the XSB2D weren't exactly bad planes or anything. Of course, the latter of them failed due to the Navy wanting something different now, but still, Douglas made an incredibly bold move in purposefully ending the BTD project at just 30 total aircraft. I do think it's likely that the Navy probably would have allowed the initial contract of 300 plus planes to be completed, and they probably would have seen some combat use late in the war, but Douglas Aircraft and Ed were in it for the long haul, and Ed knew that the BTD was doomed to be just a flash in the pan, a temporary stopgap of a plane, and decided to be daring. Really, the story of the BTD just goes to show that sometimes trusting your gut and also your mind pays off, and going for the bigger long-term goal is better than the smaller short-term goal. Take it from Douglas Aircraft and Ed Heinemann. Dream big. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. As I'm writing this, the Ravens just played the Bengals. As I'm recording this, it's the day after that. And the game ended on another missed call by the referees. Well, 2 missed calls on the same play. But it did benefit the Ravens, so I think I'll let it slide. But it also seems like the refs have been pretty bad about these kind of calls this year. But I think we do also say that every year in the NFL. Also, I think Al Michaels should probably just retire. He always sounds bored now. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.